Hello, welcome and thank you for coming. My name is Prax. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about player creators and as participants in the game design process and trying to understand, maybe also from their own perspective, how they participate in making your games, what is their position in comparison to yours, also in terms of power, and the ideas that we can, from this fairly critical look on the way player creators are participating in the design of games and maybe then also get treated in this environment, get some sort of input on what we could be doing when we make our own games and how we can relate to player participants in this sense. I have been writing a dissertation on a topic that is quite similar to this. Here you see the cover. That is called Co-Creative Game Design as Participatory Alternative Media. And based on this work and a little bit more, I am presenting to you today. So, welcome to Player Creators as Self-Determined Hedonists, ? Is that really the reality that we're looking at? So, from this perspective of my dissertation, there was already some sort of critical work that wanted to understand how players influence the design of the game, and then take a look at the political perspectives of that. What is their power position in this? Can we understand it from the lens of exploitation or participation? How can we make sense of this? And I started with the first discussion of how far does player participation, how far does co-creation even go? When I talk about players also making games, what does that mean? Does it mean that they play games and that is creative as well? Nah, well, that would make everything co-creation. That would be quite a useless point. So I started out with some data collection, and in that case, I started collecting data from World of Warcraft, which is an interesting example for the reason that it has been so extremely successful in influencing what the game industry, especially in MMOs, looks like. On the other hand, by now it's also quite old, so I guess it is sort of slowly phasing out, but it still had a number of very interesting examples for how players participated in it, and also had this massive, vibrant community. So I would like to share with you some examples of what I consider co-creative game design. This is a screenshot of what an add-on in World of Warcraft can do. An add-on is a small script written in Lua that is on top of the interface of World of Warcraft and that modifies how the interface works for the players that have that particular add-on installed. This add-on was called Virtual AR, and what it allowed players was to draw on the surface of the game. So here you see that this is the floor, the terrace on which people would be fighting a boss while they are attempting to kill the Lich King, right? This is this Lord of all the Undead. You see all the skulls around here. And the boss is going to be standing somewhere here in the middle. And what he does frequently, and that is a boss mechanic that comes back in these games quite a lot because it has to do with location and three-dimensional spaces, he throws out some sort of projectile. And you as a player, you should make sure that whenever that boss shoots at you, that only you get hit and not the people around you. Otherwise, that damage splashes over, more than 2 people get hit, and your group is going to die. So what this add-on allowed people was to basically draw these circles on the level so that it was visible for all the players in that group. So their raid leader would download the add-on, all the others in the group as well. He would draw these circles on the floor and broadcast it to the rest, and they would accept it, and then they could see what their party member had created. That made it very easy to avoid this mechanic, because now everybody could basically just stand in their circle and be pretty sure about it. Okay, so if I'm standing in the center of my circle and everybody else is doing that as well, then we'll be killing that boss because we won't have any splash damage to the other characters. This was hugely successful. It was downloaded millions of times. Also because communicating location in this game was difficult anyways. So if you look at that and want to communicate, say as a raid leader, you stand over here, at the second big skull on the right or something, like it's really difficult. So oftentimes you would have in a game the player really walking there, jumping up and down while talking. You stand here, and then he goes to the next place. And you stand here where I'm jumping now. It's a horrible process. This made that so much easier. There was another group of people for whom this was great, and these were people with hearing impairments. So if communication that was voice over IP reliant couldn't work so well for them, having this added channel of communication really made the game much more easy for them as well. So there's really an accessibility issue that this add-on solved. However, it didn't stay at that you could draw things yourself in the game. Instead, that particular add-on was connected to another one that already existed before. That was called Deadly Boss Mod. It was a boss timer that whenever you were trying to kill a boss, here you see this huge slime monster here in the middle, right? Whenever you would kill a boss, that add-on would tell you when this boss would use its next ability. It came from the very early bosses and sort of the first ones that ever existed in World of Warcraft, a huge dragon, and at some point it's going to use its ability called Deep Breath, and its fire like goes over the entire room, and you need to know when that happens to go to the sides and avoid it or you're dead. So from then on, they made a timer, like an add-on that knew, okay, so now they engage this dragon. In minute 2, minute 3, and minute 4, it's gonna use deep breath. So I'm just gonna tell the player, right? And then it pops up, it says 3 seconds until deep breath, 2 seconds, so people can orient themselves. So they have timers when these abilities come. So you connect that to the add-on that can draw on the world, and that can help you massively. Here we have another, the slime boss, who every now and then slows out one of those projectiles, like a slime bomb. He throws one at the location of every player, every avatar at that moment. That projectile travels for a while and then hits that floor, at the floor there. So what that means is that you have to move away from the position where you are at the moment when he uses his ability. But you can also not go anywhere else that another raid member stood, because that place will also get hit. So when people tried to kill that boss, they had to devise quite complex sort of dances and plans to avoid walking to places that where other players stood before, and to designate particular rooms in the particular areas in the room as safe. We can then run after the project that has been going out. All of that was made more difficult by randomly showering one part of the room in slime, poisonous slime anyways. So you couldn't do it the same. You couldn't do the same dance every time. You had to adapt that on the fly. So it was difficult, right? That was what the boss fight was about. It was about finding a smart way to deal with this shift in location in the room of where you could survive and where you had to be, all the while adapting to changing environments. This add-on made that way easier because it did one thing. At the point where that projectile went out, it drew a red circle under your feet on the floor, under the feet of every participant in the game. So now you see all these red circles, right? So now that complex choreography, this dance of where are we going to be in the room at which point, it got trivialized to don't stand in a red circle. It was super easy. Everybody could kill that boss, right? So this player modification of the interface basically neutered that encounter design. It was so impactful that Blizzard killed the add-on. They removed a part of the API that made it impossible for it to communicate space in a general possibility, in a general manner anymore, and the add-on was broken. Maybe they didn't also like that people would do this with their game world. That's entirely possible. And I have taken a pretty or nice picture here, of course. On the other hand, the add-on had a built-in consent element, because you would only see things that people had created if you accepted to see their work, and then you could also remove it again. So it wasn't really spamming other people. So Blizzard, the company who owned the game, killed that add-on. And that wasn't such an easy decision to take, actually, because there was some fallout. If you remove something from an API like that, there are other add-ons that use that same feature as well that you maybe didn't want to take away. They die as well. So now your millions of players who have been using these modifications to the game, they suddenly stand without and log into the game with a malfunctioning interface. So there is some sort of fallout based on this decision. Anyways, it was taken to remove that from the game. So I think this example very much highlights one way of looking at co-creative game design, because if you are going to a point where you say that the company who publishes and makes, in quotation marks, the game is removing an add-on because that changes their design, you cannot really argue anymore that the players didn't have a design impact or there's some design themselves. So this is what I mean with co-creative game design. And my point is here that player involvement in these cases can go as far as really impacting and changing the design of the game. This is another screenshot from my research where I have annotated all the interface elements in, at that point, the default version of World of Warcraft that have in some way, shape or form been predated by player-created interface add-ons that did the same thing. So that means that I took a screenshot of my default interface at that point and looked at, annotated everything that had previously been made by players. So this floating combat text here that you see how much damage you take floating over your character, well, that was a player-created add-on first before Blizzard included it into the game. Raid frames, player-created add-on first. Bars for shaman totems, because they're kind of clunky to use. Well, that was a player-created add-on, and now it got included into the game. So you see that nearly, most of the interface features of World of Warcraft are innovations from players that then have, in retrospect, been included into the default UI by Blizzard. And yet another case where I want to show a little bit of more the sort of emotional perspective on this. This is a little online learning tool that's called the Terran Gorefield Simulator. It's a flash game that simulates a particular element of a boss fight in World of Warcraft yet again. So this was a fight where the boss would put an ability on you that would make you die after a few seconds pass, and then your spirit or your ghost comes out of yourself, but your body gets resurrected as a bunch of skeletons. And those skeletons start racing off to kill your entire raid group. And the only one who can do anything to them and kill them is your own spirit. But that was super difficult because you didn't see the user interface that you would have in this form before. You had no idea about what your abilities were or how they were mapped to your buttons or anything like that. Basically, the game was in the middle of a boss fight, throwing players in a situation where they have to, on the fly, learn the interface for this new thing that they are piloting. And if they fail grasping that super fast, the entire group is going to die because they were too slow. That is really harsh design, because it meant that people who would be part of the raid would maybe be in a position typically where you making a mistake wouldn't kill everybody. I mean, some people really like that kind of challenge. They play their main tank or some of the central healers or something like that, and they want to have that pressure. But many people maybe don't. They would prefer that they can make a mistake and slip up without getting screamed at by 25 people. So this wasn't really up to them then anymore, because this encounter would put them into this situation. So this person, a raid leader, a German guy, made this flash game where you could test this, right? Here's the boss and the guild, and here now is your spirit and the ghosts. And it had the interface bar that is now not hidden by the text, where you would have the same buttons to press that you would have in the game, so you could literally practice it sort of dry before you would attempt the boss. Why was he doing that? Why did he make that? Here's his own reasoning. It's a crazy pressure on you. The simulator was supposed to take that pressure from the people. It is often the case that when people make a mistake in a raid, they get flamed. I have experienced that myself, and it's really not pretty. They really come down on you. That happens often in World of Warcraft. It happens in many raids. I think it's awful it really gets to you. So his motivation for making this practicing tool was not to kill the boss faster. It was to make sure that the people in his group wouldn't be subjected to this peer pressure and wouldn't get stigmatized in that sense, even though they were maybe those people who didn't want to have that responsibility in the first place. So in this case, something that I would call maybe harsh design, but maybe on purpose, getting a bit softened up, giving an alternative path for people to take by the creation of a player. And really an emotional side to this. This is basically emotional work. That is somebody trying to protect the emotions of the people in his group. So from this, I developed a definition for what I would consider co-creative game design, where it is necessary that player creator changes the properties of a game from which play emerges for a considerable group of people, so not just for themselves, and does that with a distinct creative activity to exclude people who are playing the game, and by that changing the game, so there should be something more to that. And there's a political dimension with the potential to subvert or contest the original design of the game. It should be something that has a possibility of changing what this game is about in some kind way, shape, or form. And then I want to give you a last example to start with of what I consider co-creation. So, and that is stepping away a little bit from the modification of the add-on and just looking more at interesting ways of players to be central parts of the game community. So this is a work that is based on an interview with Paragon. Paragon was a World of Warcraft raiding guild that has been insanely successful. It's a group of people, it's a Finnish guild, so they are only speaking Finnish or have been speaking Finnish in their chat. And in what is called the race for world first, where people attempt to kill bosses in World of Warcraft the fastest in the world, they have been dominating that race for, I think, like 4 years in a row, nearly getting every world first. So they were insanely successful in this attempt. What does that look like, racing for world first? Well, that means that whenever a new boss level or a new raid is published in World of Warcraft, whatever you were doing at the time, you put aside, and then you play for 18, 20 hours a day until the boss is dead. How long does it take? Well, if it's a short level with a few bosses, maybe 3 weeks, might be 2 months. right? It's like that is a very fringe activity. And these people oftentimes, outside of this extreme practice, which is really the race to be the fastest in the world, and they compete with other teams across the globe, they don't play so much World of Warcraft actually outside of this race. They are just interested in this extreme fringe, extreme high performance, high pressure activity. However, they are so good at that, or in this case, we're so good at that, that they are getting to the point where they are faster than the game designers. So in this particular instance, they arrived at a special boss, this Sinestra, some sort of Twilight dragon, and you could only ever get to this encounter if you had already killed all the bosses before on hard mode. And then, like a little door opened in the floor under the last boss, and you could climb down to this basement and would encounter this dragon. So sort of as a surprise Easter egg boss fight for the people who have been beating the hardest version of the game already. I never saw her. I mean, I've been playing, and it's not like for lack of trying. I have been actually raiding at the time, but I never even got close to beating all the hard mode bosses and this level, and seeing this one. However, Paragon did, and they did that in such a speed that when they arrived at Sinestra, she wasn't ready. So she was not functioning proper. So from an interview with them, they were telling me that, so basically they continued building the boss as we killed the boss. And then you see how sort of cynical they are about that. At least we knew that they were at work, you know? So maybe we can come back later and kill it while they are sleeping, so they don't get to change the boss between pulls, right? Between different attempts. So they are literally trying to think about when are people on the West Coast in the US sleeping, so that at that point at least we can sort of try to kill the boss in peace, and she won't get changed in between our attempts to kill her, because they were literally changing and sort of still experimenting with mechanics and completely changing the boss and how it worked. So why would I call that co-creative game design? To a point that these extreme practices of raiding are really mostly, of course, play, but they are extremely visible in the community, to a point that especially their boss kill videos and their tactics have millions of viewers, and the way they play the game is really setting the standard for how everybody else is going to do it afterwards. Me, as a humble sort of 9-to-5 work time and then maybe twice in the evening raider at that point, I would just try to replicate their tactics and just try to execute what they had been pioneering, and basically that's what everybody else did as well. So if they would make the choice of using, I don't know, only ranged characters for a particular boss, then Blizzard would face thousands of posts from people who played melee characters asking why their particular character was not usable in this boss fight, because their way of playing the game became the way of playing the game. Yet, they were treated in a way that made them actually sort of contest the ability of Blizzard to be the referee or even the creator of their particular style of play, which is this race for world first. And they tried to route around them and basically practically dispute their authority over the race. So the questions then that we want to talk about after we have sort of discussed a little bit what do we mean with co-creative game design are, how do these co-creators feel about that? What does this practice look like from a political perspective on power? And some of the arguments that we hear there a lot, and they are not only used in games, they are used in when we're discussing participants on social media who put information on Facebook or similar things. This is used in the sort of collaborative production of music or film in many of these areas. The arguments kind of go like this. Well, they know what they're getting into. They knew that they wouldn't get paid for this, like this is our IP and they started it anyways, right? So what do they have to complain about if they work for free? Argument one. Then we have, well, there's a mutual benefit, right? For them, the game gets better, and for us, we sell more or something like that. And so then they get something out of their work, so they do get a reward. And third, well, they're doing it, so they seem to have fun. Maybe this is a way of playing, right? This is positive, and otherwise, why would they be doing it anyways? So let's take a look at the last case here that is trying to explore these issues besides just showing what co-creative game design can look like. And this is the case of Andre. Andre has been a young Swedish man, at that point, in that case a teenager, who has been really successful in playing World of Warcraft, and it just came out. However, it turns out that in the early days of World of Warcraft, killing giant fire monsters wasn't actually the only challenge to solve when you wanted to raid in World of Warcraft. There was also another problem, and that was the interface of the game. In the early heydays of World of Warcraft raiding, people were raiding in 40-man groups, like 40 people together. However, the interface only ever showed you the 5 people in your little subgroup. So even if you were the raid leader or a healer or something, you would only see 5 people in your group out of those 40, like 1/8. So you had no idea as a raid leader, how many of our people are dead? As a healer, you would have to put in a healer in every 8 of these little groups just to have somebody who could see the actual hit points that people had left. So it was basically so clunky that it hardly worked. In this environment, Andre, together with another colleague, they wrote one of the most successful add-ons in that time, which is CT-Mod. You see it up here. And the simple thing it does is it gives you the health and mana bars of your 40 raid members. You can click them to target them, and then you can heal them. So now if you're a healer in this raid group, it doesn't matter if you're in group 1, you can still see that somebody in group 8 is about to die and you can keep them alive. If you're a raid leader, you can see what's going on with, oh, our tank is nearly dead, maybe we need some more healing on them. It massively lifts up the level that you can, on which you can play the game. It basically makes it playable at this point. Before that, the struggle with the interface was maybe bigger than the struggle with the actual bosses. So this has been downloaded by basically everybody who played the game on this level at the time. If you wanted to join the guild to raid, well, one of the things you had to do was prove that you have downloaded these add-ons. It was just the way. There was no other way to do it. So with this extreme success, him making this feature that basically should have been there and making the game playable in the first place. So what happened to him further on? Little breakpoint. What happened to me at that time? Just to tell you why this was interesting to me. I haven't been playing at these days when Andre was making these tools. I was way too casual for ever raiding Molten Core. However, roughly around that time, a little bit after that, I came to Sweden. I was following my girlfriend, who I met as an Erasmus student in Greece, and turned out to be, I guess, quite okay of a decision. This is what our family looks like, or looked like just the other week. But when I arrived in Sweden then, I was fairly lonely. I didn't have so many connections, didn't have so many friends, and I was playing back with people in Germany and was playing World of Warcraft a fair amount with them. So what World of Warcraft gave me in this situation was the possibility to feel that I was still connected, and it also gave me a possibility to experience myself as somebody who is able to maintain social connections, to be also a leader, a raid leader, or a group leader, and something like that. So it was really useful for maintaining sort of my feeling of self-worth in an environment where I still had to learn the language and sort of reorient somewhere completely new. So that made me, for the first time, interested in this topic in the first place, to continue working with it as a researcher. So from a fairly positive perspective. So this is what my interface looked like at the time. This is a literal screenshot of me trying to kill a giant spider. My character is standing somewhere here, tanking the monster over there. And you see that I am using a lot of add-ons, right? I mean, this interface looks like crap. Don't employ me as a graphic designer. So we have basically similar to what Andre created in CT-Mod, a mod here that shows my group members. There's another one that shows now this time how much life they are missing from their total. Here's another add-on that shows how much damage people have done in this fight to the boss. Here's another add-on that shows how much threat is caused on this particular boss. I'm the highest one because I'm the tank, so I better should be. And all kinds of other things going on at the same time. So it's very confusing and very much, but it was really the way to play. This is what people's interfaces, I mean, maybe a little bit better organized. This is roughly what they looked like. So at this point, Andre's creations, some years after he made them, had become the normal way to play. So normalized that there's many, many versions of them doing different things with slight variations. So when, but yeah, back to Andre. When he continued working on CT-Mod, at some point Blizzard wanted to remake how the add-ons functioned. Blizzard had the problem that add-ons became too automatic. They would start taking decisions themselves. They would basically play the game for you. So what Blizzard said is they would like to limit what add-ons can do. And if the players want to maintain the possibility to have add-ons at all, they would basically have to make that happen themselves. So they invited what was called the task force which is the most successful add-on authors in World of Warcraft, to come and work with them to build an infrastructure that would allow them to keep having add-ons, but limit the possibilities of them acting for themselves in the world, in the game world. So that's what they did. Some of them were flown over to Blizzard, others worked from home, and so they were invited to literally contribute in making the game and write code that was used by Blizzard. And they did. Of course, they were super excited about the possibility, Andre, at that point as well. Like, as a teenager, you get invited to work with Blizzard, and your work will be part of the game. Well, that's great. Of course, you take that shot. So you go there and participate in that. And this is sort of from examples that I have found that the player creation and the code that players create literally goes into the game. This is one of the strongest examples for what co-creative game design can be. So here we have really players being literally part of making the game. However, what does that look like if we look at it from a participation perspective? So participation, for example, as a theoretical tool, is coming from two perspectives. There's one perspective that looks at sociological participation, where the question is more, are you somehow part of this process? And another one, which would be political participation, is much more focused on what is the power distribution and the power relationship between the different participants in the situation. So just to give you some literature here and some backgrounds with different theoretical perspectives here, the one that I think is a little bit dated, but is still quite useful, is Arnstein's ladder of participation, which is a theoretical model that is basically devised for looking at how citizens are included into decision-making processes in democratic society. However, it is still quite useful here, and it features a ladder that shows that the lowest level of participation is sort of starting by 1, and the highest would be at 8, where the highest is citizen control. There would be elections, citizens are directly involved in decision making, and then it sort of goes down. And delegated power, this is probably typically what we have in our political system. Partnership, where citizens still have a power position, or participants have a power position. They get to voice their ideas and their concerns, and they actually have some possibility of making things happen. And they don't just have to in the lower levels, they would get to, still say what they would like to have, but they wouldn't have any possibility of making it happen. They wouldn't get the power related to that. And then coming down to consultation, we asked you, but your opinions aren't really worth all that much. Informing, here we let you know what's happening. Therapy, where it's like, this happened, but you're still important to us. And in the end, manipulation. That is not participation at all. That is just but you were also part of the process, even though the only reason why you were part of this process is to be able to afterwards tell people that they were. There are some more complex analysis tools, theoretical ones, that look kind of like this. If you want to delve deeper into this as well, just to give you an example, this is a recent work from Nico Carpentier, which is a media professor in Uppsala University in the media department. So this is there are these theoretical tools if you're interested in using that in your work as well. And one of the central aspects is that we look at power. Right? So we look at what is the power relationship between these different participants in the situation in order to understand, is this something that we would call participation, or is this maybe something else? So in this power relation here, this is quite straightforward in the situation that Andre was in, is that Blizzard, the company, was really quite all-powerful. They would decide what was going to happen, and they had the possibility to decide about if something gets included or not. However, the player contributors also had some sort of power, because they were the ones in the end building that new framework, that new sandbox system that would go inside the game. So they were the ones who were doing most of the work, while Blizzard was the ones who were sort of having the managerial power position to decide if something would go in or not. So in this case, some sort of generative power lies in the perspective in the position of the player creators, while the company has the power to decide as a manager over what is happening here. Players would have the possibility of generating support from the player, from all the millions of players who are using their creations, right? If Blizzard kills the API and all the add-ons, then all kinds of, many players, millions of them, would suddenly sit without a functioning interface for their game. And they might be unhappy about that. But that power position is really just consumer power. That is the possibility of people saying, hey, your game isn't as good anymore. I think I'm going to put my money somewhere else. Including that in a participatory process is quite problematic, because in this case, any consumer would automatically be a participant with a power position. So that doesn't function very well. Instead, we see that something that player creators did in this case is that they did include, for example, they weren't allowed to talk about this task force when they were coming to Blizzard. They had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which meant that they weren't really at freedom to speak about that. They did, however, include their participation as an Easter egg in the code of the interface modifications they were writing. So if you wanted to, you could open up some of the code in the game at that time and find references to the names of the player creators who have been part of building this. But it wasn't visible to the players at large. It was basically hidden away, where there is actually a long history and tradition of player creators and game designers trying to do this and hiding Easter eggs where they would like to claim authorship or creative authorship over the managers who maybe try to forbid that. So Blizzard is here clearly the powerful actor and quite privileged, also because they control the access to technology, and the player creators are really not the privileged party in this environment. So that perspective of participation is quite troubling because it sort of means that we are in between. We don't really have a situation where we can talk about the levels or the ladder of participation so well, because we have a high level of influence on the actual outcome of the process, but very little power on the side of the players to decide about what was going to happen. So it doesn't really fit all that well, these different theoretical perspectives. So I propose that we could, in this case, for example, look at another theoretical framing for this, where we don't have full participation versus interaction, which would be one way of doing this, or minimum maximum participation, but instead some sort of managed participation and managing participation, where up here we would have the player creators who have a big influence on what is actually happening, but they can take the decisions, and down here we have the managers who don't do anything in practice, but have all the decision-taking power. So in this perspective, in this case where we have literally players writing code in a game for an established international company who's worth millions of dollars but doesn't pay them, can we still talk about player creators enjoying their free time here and talking about mutual benefit and the understanding that this work is for free? Well, from Andre's perspective, nowadays he's looking back at this fairly bummed about that. I mean, at that point, of course, he was young and he was, I wouldn't say naive, but if we talk to him now, he's like, wow, they got the knowledge and the expertise of basically the top add-on developers in the world who had developed like software that was used by millions of people for free, nearly. What they got was a warm handshake, a bit of, I think, like 2 years of playtime in World of Warcraft like access cards. Like, there you go. And yes, they did get some access to their IRC channel with with some of the Blizzard employees in the add-on development. So they did get some inside knowledge and connections, of course. On the other hand, how much does these connections really mean if you're not allowed to talk about it? You signed an NDA, so one of the big points is, hey, you work for the games industry. Yeah, you work for free, but you can put it in your... Oh, no, you can't put it in your portfolio. That's forbidden. So that is a big problem. And that is not necessarily something that if your argument is, well, people are taking an open and clear decision, but we still sort of contractually bind them to never talk about their involvement. That doesn't go together very well. That sort of shows that there is some problematic and sort of power mismatch happening here. Then the other element of this was that this entire activity was precluded with the fact that Blizzard wanted to kill add-ons in general. And these had been people who had been writing them and had been making things that millions of players had been appreciating. So now that is sort of aching to the situation where Blizzard was keep holding add-ons hostage for these players to then come and participate in building a system for them according to their specifications. Because otherwise, not only their social status as add-on makers, but also having made things for all these people who appreciated that would have gone away. So it's not at all really a situation where people are taking a free and informed consensual decision to participate in your project and everything is clear from the start. But there's a clear power difference between these actors here that really plays to how these decisions are taken and how these processes work, right? Just thinking about the emotional impact of this, the emotional side of making these sort of add-ons and helping people that you maybe feel like you have some sort of reason to protect. Well, if that is threatened, if something like that would be taken away, that is not such a free decision anymore. So thinking about that, this idea that, yeah, this is basically something that is fair, they know what they're getting into, that is a bit problematic. There's also other cases that show this power difference and in ways are quite strange in how this is handled. One of the add-ons that has for World of Warcraft been the most successful was Quest Helper. What Quest Helper did is it was optimizing your questing. So it would give you, for example, it would read out your quest log of all the quests you had, and then calculate, sort of solving a traveling salesman problem for you, where to go first, what to kill, how many, and then where to go next. So it calculated the route for you to optimize your questing. So instead of, many gamers, especially if you level your second or third character or whatever, you're not really interested in figuring out what exactly the quest description says where you need to go. So Quest Helper just tells you, go there. Yeah, these are the things you have to kill. On average, this many, and then next, and next, and next, next. So it's really optimizes your play experience in just pulling up another character and questing it to max level. It was so successful that Curse, the website that distributes add-ons, whenever Quest Helper would have a new version coming out, the Curse servers would crash because so many people would download this new version of this game, of this add-on. That happened for any other. Didn't happen for any other. And the guy who developed this, Curse, this company who runs or did run based on being an access port for add-ons, they had a premium model or a freemium model where you could, if you wanted to, buy a premium downloader, and part of that income was paid back to add-on developers. So because of this, the popularity of Quest Helper, the guy who made this add-on could pay his rent with the money, with the income from his add-on. At some point, Blizzard incorporated, yet again, another add-on functionality like the one from Quest Helper into their main interface, basically copying exactly the same things that Quest Helper already did into their main game. And, well, of course, the downloads of the add-on subsided, and that guy was left with nothing. There was no thank you, there was no, oh yeah, and there wasn't even a communication with him before. So a way of treating player participants in a sense that really seems tone deaf in this environment. Right? And especially if we think about that, so big parts of the game's industry and contemporary game culture are very tightly connected to player co-creation and participation. Many of the titles that are the most relevant and the most prominent today in contemporary gaming culture or esports have at some point been player-created. Counter-Strike was a mod for Half-Life that is now a CSGO filling arenas and has been one of the first versions of competitive shooters who are now everywhere. Another good example for that are MOBAs, which have been based on, in some way of another, Dota, which was a mod for Warcraft 3. So League of Legends with its 100 million players. Well, Dota as well. Other incantations of that. Here's a picture from the International from Dota, or even Heroes of the Storm, as now Blizzard's version of sort of the same game design. They have all come out of player innovation, right? Where players came up with new features and design versions. And even today, sometimes the economy of these games are built on player participation, like Dota's, where players or artists outside of Valve create assets that are then being sold over Steam to make money and fund the entire game. So yet another way for player creativity to become a central aspect of what game development looks like today. Yet that is not really reflected in how we attribute authorship or understand game creation. Oftentimes we still stand on a position where, well, these are players and then we have game creators. Those are the ones who create, right? So this is just a quote from one of the Blizzard community managers. We create, you play. You provide feedback, we iterate. Well, based on the examples that I've given you today, that is just factually wrong. Game design is what the game designer does, is sort of one of the ways of understanding how this responsibility is distributed. And again, here, that becomes quite problematic if we think about all the ways in which players are involved. So, and this is not a new thing either. I'm pulling up examples from modding or from more modern games, but if we are honest with ourselves, and we look at the past of where games come from, well, participatory and sort of collective creation of games has been where it's at. Even if we stay with the MMOs like World of Warcraft and sort of similar titles, Their origin, sort of their grandfather in production, the first one would be Mud, Richard Bartle's multi-user dungeon as the first sort of text-based virtual world. But based on his design, there were quickly many other versions of text-based virtual worlds growing up. They were openly shared, their code was shared, and they had this massive, bubbly, creative, like insane fast iterations community where people would take and each other's code, change it a little bit, put out their version, make it open, accessible for others. And that resulted, for example, in DQ Mud, which was a version of Mud that was created at the ITU, the Technical University in Copenhagen. And DQ Mud was the iteration of Mud that was most focused on gameplay and combat. And it can really be seen as the sort of game design grandfather of, yes, EverQuest, Ultima Online, and World of Warcraft. To the point that there was some controversy around the design of EverQuest, where the EverQuest designers were asked if they had copied and pasted code from DQ Mud because they had the same combat stats. They declared that they hadn't, and the guys behind DQ Mud was like, yeah, we believe you. But they had literally just taken the design from these creators that has come out of this collective process, built a visual front end to it, and there you go. So, and that sort of perspective on how combat works is continued in contemporary virtual worlds. Do you know the holy trinity of MMOs, right? Tank, healer, and DPS? Why do we have that? Anybody? In the situation in virtual worlds that are text-based, you can't really tell who is close to a boss or how people are related to each other in space, because your room is like a nondescript, like it doesn't have locality, right? You are in the room and so are some others, but where you are in relationship to each other is undefined. So if you want to figure out which one of those characters is the one that the dragon is actually biting, you need another way to solve it. So you use threat. You have a resource like threat that shows that the one who has the most threat, that's the one that the boss is attacking. That's where this comes from. Nowadays, it's everywhere. It's just like unquestioned game design. That comes from a solution for figuring out who to attack in a sort of non-physical and not 3D space of text-based virtual worlds and combat mechanics. So what that means is basically that participatory game creation has been going on in the past as the normal way of coming up with new iterations and new versions ways to design games. And that has been going on throughout this entire time. And it's still happening. Talking about the rise of indie is kind of strange and missing the point. The point of the matter, that is really that indie has been there all this time. Indie is where we came from, and indie is where we are going maybe now again. But that has been existing all this time. And even under that participatory, sort of non-commercial, shared, open game design. So from that perspective, if we see this reality of that, well, participation and participatory design, co-creation is really everywhere. It's where we come from in this medium. What can we do about this? The fact that maybe players aren't necessarily always coming into a situation with informed, free choices, but that there's a power instability. Well, some starting points. Informed consent doesn't solve everything, but it's a first step, and it's something that needs to be updated. If you're a game developer, make sure that really the people who are working on your game and making it better know what is happening. If they are extending their involvement, well, you need to negotiate that. Is that still what's happening? Are we still sort of on the same page about that? And this is just starting points. The entire esports scene that has now sort of been gobbled up by games like Dota, League of Legends, all these esports leagues, these teams, this entire culture around that has been grassroots player built. I still remember when my brother was playing Dota and he was a part of the sort of competitive league back in Germany that was when it was still a mod for Warcraft 3, right? There wasn't a sort of professional, like a Dota published by Valve at that point. So they already had infrastructure for that. They had people who would plan matches, see who won against whom and what the points were in the league right now. They had systems in place to prevent cheating and levers, and they had built this entire culture already. So there were decades of time of grassroots involvement and work going into building these kind of cultures that are now then taken by a company who's really producing a game without connecting back to these kind of groups. So the fact that you can take over some sort of culture doesn't necessarily mean you should. You should maybe have a very clear conversation with the people who have been part of making this culture so far. And, well, don't necessarily break what other people made in this environment. We're talking about power. Think about and maybe use something like as crude a tool as this ladder is to think about your power relation with the people around you. And granted, as a game developer, you're oftentimes communicating with people that are several magnitudes more than you are on the team. But that doesn't give you the sort of free pass to use your power position or your control over tech and bottlenecks to shut down their creativity. What they made is typically theirs. So think about, where are we? Are we really just telling people, oh yeah, this is what we're going to do? Or is it even worse? Are we telling people, oh, we want to hear about your opinions, but we actually really don't care all that much? Or are we trying to approach some sort of partnership where we invite people who are part of making our games what they are and even give their words some weight in this decision making, right? We should approach this and these players that are working with our games and make them into something more interesting, really as partners, in a sense, as far as we can. We still probably run a company that needs to make money, but that doesn't mean that we need to mistreat the people that are, in a sense, part of the group that makes our games great. There are great examples of how this can work. For example, talking and coming back to this accessibility perspective on add-ons. This is an add-on that has been made in conjunction with Blizzard and the add-on modder community, where they got a request, the community got a request for an add-on that would allow you to move your avatar with mouse clicks, because there were a number of players who didn't have the possibility to use two arms to play at the same time because they had accessibility limitations. So this was something that add-ons couldn't by themselves do at that point anymore, because add-ons aren't allowed to move your character. So somebody from inside Blizzard, in this case, one of the Blizzard developers, made an exception and created together with them, and then they published this add-on, which basically gives you virtual buttons to move your character around in the game world, allowing for people to play the game now with only the mouse, so that they can even continue playing with their friends. And there's a number of this. Add-ons for accessibility is an ongoing project that is trying to work in this direction. So there are very positive examples for how this can work as a partnership. So, and maybe the last point is, well, give credit where credit is due. This doesn't necessarily need to mean that you have to give up ownership over your game, or that you have to pay everybody who's in the community and at some point decided without asking you, oh, now I'm going to build something. Of course not. But if somebody makes something, if somebody is part of a creative process that makes a contribution to your game, well, mention them, share credit, give credit, right? I mean, this is not a crazy thing. This is exactly how the environments with early mud games and their big quick iterations worked. They give credit to the people who built the versions before. It's also sort of incidentally how academia works. Well, we credit the work on which shoulders we stand. Sort of obviously, automatically. That's just something we do. There's no reason not to do that. So that might just yet be the most important point, without necessarily threatening your claim on intellectual property or anything like that. Show if somebody has been participating in making your game. Well, let them show that. Let them use it in their portfolio, and maybe have their names in your credits. Because I think this is something where, in the end, if we recognize that this is where a big part of our contemporary gaming culture and industry has its roots, then now turning around and saying, no, we turn everything into walled gardens, nobody gets to get in here, and we are the ones who make games, and all you guys, you're all out. That's not only misunderstanding our own history, but it's also massively reducing the places we can go in the future. So, thank you very much. All right, let's have some questions.
How would you say that games that are more of, let's say, like EVE Online, where there's a player-run economy and politics going on, where that's the main part of the game for probably most players, would that be a players co-creating, or would that just be them playing? Where
I think
the
for
line go there?
Thank you. Of course, there's always this one person who brings up EVE. Without being an EVE player myself, I'm maybe not masochistic enough. I think that if you're playing the game, that is not necessarily co-creative. It depends. It needs to be something more. The point with this definition is that I wanted to have some sort of political element to it. So if you widen what you understand as co-creation too much, so at some point every play is co-creative, then the notion becomes useless. So no, I wouldn't say that. However, I think it could be relevant for discussing things like people built casinos where now you can gamble with EVE currency online, and that is massively impacting what the game in the end becomes. So I think that would be an example of definitely co-creative game design. I mean, maybe something else to highlight. Co-creative game design doesn't make the game better necessarily, right? So I think this would be a case where I could talk about, this kind of thing that is happening in EVE currently, where now the most important or most powerful people in the game are the ones who own the casinos, not who own the fleets. I think that's an element of that, where we need to have then, or where they should have a conversation. And I know that the company that is running EVE is inviting their players to conventions, to have conversations with them. So that might just be a positive example to aspire to. Thank you. Any other questions? Like, if you don't have one, I can actually follow up this point a little bit, because it's something that is coming out quite often. The idea that I would be making the point that co-creative games are necessarily better, I think sometimes they can be. On the other hand, it's also very strong. There's a very strong pressure in player-created content to optimize for strength and power in the game, which can be quite problematic. So, for example, things like gear score calculators that came into World of Warcraft and immediately overnight changed the social makeup of how the game works. And suddenly you as a person or your experience was all secondary. The only thing that mattered was the number that this gear score add-on would spit out when somebody would mouse over your character. That is an element where I would say, wow, that's horrible. That should not be there. But on the other hand, it has a clear impact. So it's still sort of co-creative design. So I don't think that is necessarily making the game better, but it is impacting it, which is maybe yet another argument for having a conversation with your player creators about maybe what your vision is and coming up with an idea with what they want to do as well, because you will have them impacting your game no matter if you want that to happen or not. So a few years ago, I played Age of Conan with a friend who has a high-level character, and he just let me raid a little bit in a raid, and I had never done that before. And so I was standing there and throwing my, fireballs or something. I was like, how do I know how much damage I'm doing? And he's like, you don't. Like, but so I don't have a damage meter that calculates and optimizes, and so that I can check back what I do. No, that doesn't exist. Okay, that's weird. How do I know if I do so much damage that the boss is gonna attack me? You don't know that. It's like, wow, that's weird. Now I really feel like I'm playing blind here. Like I can't optimize my performance, because that's what in my head this was about. This was about me optimizing my character to the cutting edge of what I can accomplish in order to. But it also wasn't necessary. It was fine to press the buttons that I wanted to press, and as long as the group was in a good mood and we were okay with dying once or twice and nobody made crazy mistakes, the boss died. And that was fine, and it was actually way more chill, and we could have people in the group that were maybe not amazing at their game, and it still worked as a social thing. That ship has sailed for World of Warcraft, partly because of player interventions that really were focused on optimizing the game. So, as a point of stressing that, if you don't have this conversation with your player creators, then you might also not have a say in that conversation of something that changes the direction of your game, whether you want it or not. I'm not sure. How much time do we have left? We still have 5 minutes. So yeah, we have a question from.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was thinking you mentioned this whole thing about not breaking what others had, worked on and built. What about cases like Counter-Strike gambling, which was part of a lot of controversies? Is that a case where maybe you should actually break what the community has built, or what's your opinion on that?
Another super interesting case, CSGO Lotto. For those of you who maybe are not aware of how that works, in Valve, in Counter-Strike the items that you have that are just basically cosmetic items for what your guns look like, or knives or whatever. Like in all kinds of Steam items, you can trade them for quite big sums of real money, hundreds of dollars for a rainbow shiny knife. And then there were websites out there that allowed you to gamble with them. So you would put your weapon in a trade or something like that, and then there was a website that if enough people did that, you could sort of spin the wheel, and the person who won got the other people's items, and the others lost them. That was weighed worse by the fact that the people who owned these websites didn't disclose that when they were as huge YouTubers with a big following of underage children advocating to gamble like that to their youth followers, which led to a big group of kids using their mom's credit cards to buy items and then losing them immediately. An interesting perspective, again, of player-created content that is making probably your game and entire system worse. I think in this case, yes, you should have a conversation with them, but that is something that you should definitely ban, right? But the thing is that still, if I wouldn't sort of blame Valve for the fact that happened, right? I wouldn't say everything that ever happens with Counter-Strike or Steam or whatever is your fault, because you clearly position yourself as the designer. So somebody does something, now that's your fault as a designer. So now you have to pay like damages or something like that, right? So even in that sense, I would say, you know what? Somebody else made that. That was co-creative. Let's try to fix it so that we don't bankrupt people because their kids take their credit cards to buy Counter-Strike weapons, right? That would be great, but it's also not your fault that somebody does something crazy with your game because, let's face it, you didn't actually design this. So there's that element as well. If you neglect that, you could end up at saying, hey, now let's sue Valve because, they are the game designer, right? But yeah, that would be, I think, a misunderstanding of what the situation is like. So yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm here, so if you have questions.